I'm excited to introduce our speaker tonight, not only because he's a great guy, but because he's a good friend. Benjamin West was born in 83, and he converted to the faith and gave his life to the Lord in January 1999. Benjamin West first moved to China in 2003 at the age of 19, where he taught himself to read and write Chinese using a Bible, a dictionary, a pile of maps, and countless conversations with native Chinese all across the nation. Benjamin West is one of our IPHC missionaries to Peru and to China. He married his wife, Daisy, and they have 3 children now, 13, 15, and 16. Some fun facts about Benjamin before we hop into bringing him up here. He's fluent in 3 languages: Spanish, Chinese, and a little bit of English. He is unsuccessfully adding a 4th language, Tibetan. He got to have dinner with John Piper in 2011 after he was mentioned in one of their sermons. Interestingly enough, he attempted to go to Africa on his first missionary trip. That failed, and he ended up going to Peru, where he discovered his calling to serve there, and then ultimately in China. 20 years and 30 countries later, he still has yet to be a missionary to Africa. Would you please stand and welcome missionary Benjamin West?
Not only have I served in Africa, I've never been to Africa, not even set foot in the nation or continent, any nation in Africa. And someday I've got many invitations to go visit missionary friends who are serving there. Let me jump right in because there's a lot I want to cover, and I think you will be encouraged by the story I'm going to share with you today. Let me quickly ask, how did you celebrate your high school graduation? Keep that in mind as I begin here. How did you celebrate your high school graduation? What gift did your parents give you for your graduation? A man named William Borden. William Borden, born in 1887, was a millionaire heir. His father was a millionaire in Chicago, and he was given, upon graduation, a gift of a round-the-world trip. At the age of 16. He graduated at 16, was gifted a round-the-world journey. This is in 1904 and 1905. His trip spanned those 2 years, almost a year combined, round-the-world trip. Now, if this was our day, that would sound like the beginning of a really bad reality TV show. 16-year-old kid, round-the-world journey. We're going to follow what he does and where he goes. That's not what this story is at all. He left San Francisco. He spent time in Japan, China, Malaysia, India, Egypt, Israel, and then much of Europe. He was shocked by the idolatry and heathenism he saw in Asia specifically. And it seems that everywhere he went, the Lord put missionaries in his path. He was a Christian kid. His parents were believers, but he didn't necessarily feel called to missions or anything. But on this round-the-world journey at the age of 16, turning 17, the Lord began to stir his heart. He commented to his mother in a letter home, "You can learn more from a missionary in half an hour than you can pick up yourself in a couple of months of travel." He was traveling, but he realized he could learn more from the missionaries he met than even seeing the things he was seeing. He wrote to his mother as well, "I met such pleasant young people on the steamer who were going out as missionaries, and meeting them influenced me. While talking with them, I learned of the work and the opportunities so that I realize, as I never did before, when I look ahead a few years, it seems as though the only thing to do is to prepare for the foreign field." 16 years old, 1 month into his round-the-world trip, he's already feeling there's nothing that makes sense but to serve these unreached peoples. He also wrote later on in his journey from India, I believe, he wrote that I have so much of everything in this life. He was the child of millionaires. And there are so many millions who have nothing and live in darkness. I don't think it is possible to realize it until one sees the East, the eastern part of the world. I know it is no easy thing to serve the Lord, but others have been enabled to do so, and there is no reason why I should not. He got home in the summer of 1905. He commenced his studies as a 17-year-old at Yale University. Sometime during his freshman year at Yale, he traveled to a missions conference in Nashville, Tennessee, and he heard about the great gospel need among the world's Muslims. A man who used to be famous in our country, Christians and non-Christians alike, Dr. Samuel Zweimer, a great missionary to the Arab world, an apostle to Islam. He spoke and he impacted William Borden. Listen to this description of Zweimer. He was the man with a map, charged with enthusiasm, grim with earnestness, filled with passion of love for Christ and the perishing. He made that great map come alive, voicing the silent appeal of the Muslim world, hundreds of millions under the sway of Islam. Borden went home from the conference feeling burdened specifically to reach Muslims, and particularly the Muslims of a place called Gansu in northwest China. That was the place specifically that the Lord was calling him. But he's still a freshman in college at this point. But he never wavered from his calling. Now, let's take a break here for a minute. College students, you guys are college students. Listen to how he spent his college years. Knowing that his calling was to the mission field, he didn't just lay aside responsibilities and opportunities back home at his school. A friend wrote this about him later. He and I began to pray together in the morning before breakfast while at Yale. We had been meeting only a short time when a third joined us, and soon a fourth. The time was spent in prayer and brief reading of Scripture. We prayed for the college, our class, and for those we were seeking to bring to Christ. But listen, these prayer meetings soon began to spread around Yale University, right? This is not today's Yale, but it's still Yale University. And it says that by the end of his sophomore year, there were similar prayer groups in each of the classes. And it wasn't being passed down from the seniors to the freshmen, but from the freshmen, William Borden particularly, up to the senior class. And this prayer movement spread all throughout Yale University. One of his friends said this: it was so easy to pray with him. He could be jolly with the rest, and when the crowd was gone, it would be just as natural for him to say, "Come, let's pray together." There was no sense of incongruity about it. He was so simple in his prayer life, so natural, so trustful. He was the easiest man to pray with I have ever known. But they didn't just pray, they also actively witnessed and ministered to their unsaved classmates, of which there were many at Yale. And it was said of William Borden that he was always picking out the toughest proposition and going through thick and thin to win him for Christ. They said whenever the name would come up of some really hard person, really hard case, everyone would be quiet and like real quiet. Who's going to get him? And William would say, "Put him down to me. I got him." And he would go and he would witness and win him to the Lord. Not only that, during his underground years, he, being the heir of a millionaire, he had lots of access to money and he was in charge of lots of money. His father actually passed away when he was a sophomore, I believe. He's 18 years old. Now he is the one managing the family's finances primarily. 18 years old, access to millions of dollars. What would you do? He helped found and fund the Yale Hope Mission, a mission primarily to destitute and drunks in the town next to Yale University. He didn't only send his money, though. He would go and he would minister to them personally. On his evenings, he would minister and preach and share the gospel in the mission that he helped to found. Again, we're talking about an 18-year-old college student. Later on, while in seminary, William donated $70,000 in seminary secretly, which is worth over $20 million in our money today, to all kinds of different efforts. And he did so in secret. He tried his best. Whenever he found out somebody knew what he had done, he actually got a little angry because he was trying his best to keep it totally out of sight. One man said this, who visited the U.S., said this. He was asked what most impressed him about his visit to America. I don't know who this man was. It's in his biography. But his response was, the sight of that young millionaire kneeling with his arm around a bum in the Yale Hope Mission. That's what had impressed this visitor. He didn't just give his money, he also gave his time. As a seminary student, he was already sitting on the board of major ministry organizations, Bible societies, the China Inland Mission itself, Hudson Taylor's China Inland Mission. He was on the board already in his early 20s. After graduating from Yale, now we're getting to the the first slide, just so you know here. After graduating from Yale in 1909 and Princeton Theological Seminary 1912, his commitment to the mission field had not wavered, even in the face of intense pressure by some to take advantage of his assets and his education and use it back home instead of wasting it in China. One friend expressed surprise that he was throwing himself away as a missionary. You're throwing yourself away as a missionary. And you know what his response was? To that friend, you, my friend, have not seen heathenism. You didn't have that round the world. You didn't see what I saw in India, in Japan, in China, the shocking things he saw and wrote about. You can see some of these clippings here. Young millionaire, these are real clippings from the newspapers of the time. Young millionaire renounces world to be missionary. He makes darkest China scene of his life work. And look at the one here. Millionaire missionary, it's kind of blurry, but you can see it says usually it was the popular impression that China workers would be those who had no other opportunity back here, so they would go to China as like a last resort. That was not William Borden. And then the last one here, the question, right? What would you do in the prime of life, robust physique, cultured, possessed of $5 million and unmarried? What would you do? The obvious answer in the newspaper was you wouldn't do what he's doing. You wouldn't go there. That wouldn't make any sense. But after graduating, he spent 3 months on a speaking tour of universities and seminaries in the U.S., over 30 colleges and seminaries, not giving an apology for what he was doing, but seeking to recruit more people to join him and to go to the mission field. He went around mobilizing missionaries over 3 months before his departure, and 30 different seminaries. Listen to, this is an example of what he would say. As I read this, there's going to be some kind of rapid fire slides go across the screen that help you give a visual idea of what he was talking about. He would speak of Linsha with its bigoted, proud race of Muslims, Arabs by descent. There too were the Dongxiang, remnants of the old Hun tribes in the mountains, and the Salar from distant Samarkand with their Turkish speech and faces, Muslim exiles who had tramped across Central Asia to find a home beside the Yellow River. These mingled with Tibetans from the border marches and Mongols from north of the Great Wall. This is the place he desired to live and serve and give his life. 2 features marked this place, Gansu province. The first was its diversity. You saw just those faces and those peoples in those pictures, right, just a minute ago. The second feature was its inaccessibility. It was really hard to get to. He had visited China, but he had not made it nearly as far as Gansu in inland China, right? He would also ask the students when he would go around, and I'll turn this back on you today. If he was standing here, he might ask you the same question. One thing he would ask is, are you steering or drifting through life? Are you steering or drifting? He was a sailor. He sailed. He had yachts. His family had access to boats. Are you steering or drifting? And then he had this comment he would often make. If 10 men are carrying a log, 9 of them on the little end and 1 at the heavy end, and you want to help, which end will you lift on? The answer's obvious, right? You lift on the end that needs more help. But then he would add this, in proportion to the population, there were 500 times as many ministers in the USA than in China. So the answer to him was obvious. And then he would ask, for those who still were struggling with their faith, are you willing to be made willing? Are you willing for God to make you willing to go? Some people don't even want to go there, right? Because they know if they really think about it, God might ask them to do something like that. But Borden's words were more convicting than anyone else because he was personally willing to pay that price. He was personally willing to lay everything aside and do that thing. Here's a map of that region. You can see right in the middle, Gansu. It used to be spelled with a K. Now it's spelled with a G. You can see the Great Road going off to the northwest of there and all the other provinces around. That was Gansu, remote, far from land, far from sea, I should say, from any port, and very difficult to reach. Borden did set sail for China. He graduated in 1912. He set sail for China on December 17th, 1912. Notice that date. His biographer said he was the kind of guy that would have sailed overseas a week before Christmas because he didn't want to waste another week or another day. By setting sail on the 17th, he was scheduled to arrive in Cairo, Egypt on January 1st, start the new year in a new place. He went to Cairo to study Arabic in preparation for his future labors among the Chinese Muslims. So a few months in Cairo language school, and then on to China, on to Gansu. It was felt, this is a quote, it was felt that a few months at Cairo in the language school would be of advantage, not only for the study of Arabic and the Quran, but of Islam generally before attempting to meet it in its strongholds in Western China. But Borden wasn't content to merely study in Cairo. He dove into ministry there as well, alongside local missionaries and native believers. It was said that he began to distribute these Islamic-style tracts. They would get these little booklets, these little tracts written in Arabic in the Islamic Quranic style, and everywhere they would go in the markets in different places, they would hand them out as if they were Islamic texts, but they weren't. And they would usually get away. They only had one incident where they kind of had a little riot started and they had to escape this deal, but they're going out of their way to evangelize. He made the comment when he was in Cairo, how can we, these few missionaries, how can we get the gospel to every one of Cairo's 800,000 homes? That was his goal in those few months that he was there. I can understand that. I have the similar spirit. When I first went to Peru, I didn't speak Spanish yet. This is 20 years ago. This summer, I didn't speak Spanish yet, but I knew I could hand stuff out. So I had a friend help me translate my testimony, and I began to make copies. And the copy guy was real happy because I'd come and I'd want like another 10,000 copies of this little paper over and over again. And I would have him cut them for me, and I would share them. How can we get the gospel to every single person? I understand what he was trying to do there. Now listen carefully here. In March of 1913, Easter weekend of 1913, March 23rd, he fell ill there in Egypt. He contracted cerebral meningitis, and about 3 weeks later, he died. He died in Egypt, in his training ground. His death shocked the world, not just the Christian world, it shocked the world. It was front page news in all the newspapers. I tried to find a slide for that. I don't know why it doesn't show up. There's nothing showing up, but it was in the news around the world. William Borden, the millionaire who was heading to China, dies in Egypt, 25 years old. Shocking is what everyone said. His mother and his sister were en route to visit him, and they arrived at the hospital straight from the ship on the Suez Canal. They arrived, but they were 4 hours late. Imagine sailing across the world and arriving 4 hours after he passed. His mother wrote in a letter after seeing him on his deathbed. They didn't let her get too close because they didn't know how contagious he might be. She wrote this: I should never have known him. I should never have recognized him. His beard and mustache had grown, and the contour of his face was changed. Look at the next slide here. That comment by her shocked me because this is the picture you see of him on every biography and online. That's always the picture. And when I read that she was shocked to see his beard and mustache, I was also shocked because I hadn't seen that. I don't have a picture of his beard. But it makes sense. He was in Egypt, and he was going to work with the China Inland Mission, who were known for dressing like the natives and the locals. So, of course, in Egypt, he would have grown out his beard, and he would have tried his best to mingle and to look like one of the Egyptians that were there as best as he could. And his own mother walks in the room and says, I wouldn't have known who that was if they hadn't told me that was my son. His sudden death en route to the Gansu mission field was incomprehensible to many people. He was even slandered in the media of his day. Look at this clipping I did find. Millions to church, nothing to mother, they said. Of course, he provided for his mother in some way, but in his will, he left millions to mission agencies, including the China Inland Mission. But that was the comment in the newspaper, at least in one paper. Millions to missions, nothing to mother. Not realizing that was probably his mother's wish because she was already provided for. Was William Borden a modern day Enoch? Some wondered that, right? He loved the Lord so much, the Lord just took him. Or was his life a seed that was always meant to bear more fruit in his death than in his life? That almost seems to be the case. Many people have come to missions through his testimony, many more arguably than he would have been able to reach on his own. There is no doubt that his death gave wings to his testimony. His story is now known and told far and wide. There's a phrase or a group of phrases that are said to be William Borden's words, and evidence actually shows that it's probably not what he actually said. It was written about him. You might have heard this before. No reserve. Go back to the one previous slide. No reserves, no retreats, no regrets. It's shared as if he said it. The evidence actually is that it was written of him by his biographer in 1926. She, studying his life and reading his letters, that's how she described him. Listen to the exact quote. She said this: "No reserve, no retreat, no regrets had any place in his consecration to God." Do you hear that? One more time. No reserve, no retreat, and no regrets had any place in his consecration to God. Now let's turn the corner and kind of bring this home a little bit. Let me ask a question. Have you ever heard of William Borden before today? Anybody here? I know a couple of you have heard of William Borden. Very few. Has anyone ever heard of Gansu before today? Gansu province in China. Anybody? There's a couple hands, people that I know, not many. Gansu province. Borden was not the first nor the last to target Gansu province. Here, real quick, we're going to go through a little bit of Gansu's missionary history. Look at this next one. 1876, George Parker and his wife Minnie were the first Protestant missionaries to go to Gansu. It was actually a little scandalous. He married a Chinese woman, which at that time was not normal, and he had to fight, and Hudson Taylor himself had to stand up for this man and say, yes, they can serve and they can go to that region of China, Gansu province. The next slide, 1893, William Wallace Simpson arrived in China, spent more than 50 years serving in Gansu province. We've been to churches ourselves in China that he helped to plant. They're still there to this day. We've met some of his family that visited China to follow in their great-grandfather's footsteps. In 1918, the China Inland Mission, 5 years after Borden's death, the money he left to them, they used it to build a hospital in Gansu province, and they called it the Borden Memorial Hospital. The hospital was known locally as the Gospel Hospital, and it specialized in infectious diseases, especially leprosy. This picture is taken from inside the hospital. To this day, there's a memorial there to him, and you can see there, the Borden Memorial Hospital, a nurse gave a leper some sort of treatment. So there's a nurse, that's an old picture on the wall in the hospital still to this day. In 1923, 3 single missionaries, Mildred Cable and Francesca and Eva French, began more than a decade of evangelistic expeditions through the vast expanses of Gansu's Gobi Desert. If you Google Mildred Cable and Gobi Desert, she wrote a book about the Gobi Desert and her adventures in the Gobi Desert. She's the one on the far right of the picture. They served in the 20s and 30s there. In 1932, a young man named William Ekval Simpson, son of William Wallace Simpson. In 1932, he was shot and killed by Muslim bandits in Gansu province in the land he served. He was a missionary as well to the Tibetans of that province. He was shot and killed at the age of 30 in 1932. In 1949, communism prevailed in China, and most missionaries were expelled, including William Wallace Simpson. The Borden Memorial Hospital continued to serve for 2 more years, somehow, till 1951, and then it was taken over by the communists. That's a modern-day picture of the hospital. It's been rebuilt, it's been expanded, but the Chinese still use it as a hospital to this day in that same location where it was so many years before. We were there at one point and looking at the little museum, and a lady popped her head in and said, "Are you Christians?" She's kind of whispering and kind of being careful. I said, "Yes." "Are you?" And she said, "Yes. We actually have a little house church here on the hospital grounds. See the apartment buildings on the right side? They have housing there for nurses and workers there, and so they have a church that still meets there on the hospital campus. The 1950s, 60s, and 70s were the dark ages in China. Unspeakable things occurred during that time. If you want to read up on that, Google Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution if you dare. But the 80s brought an opening, a thawing of relations between China and the rest of the world. Now let me ask you a question here. We're in Oklahoma here, but I know there's got to be out-of-state students. Raise your hand if you're from Oklahoma in the room. Most of you. Raise your hand if you're not from Oklahoma. About half and half overall, maybe a little more on the Oklahoma side. So this next part, you don't have to ignore it, but it's specifically related to our state here. In 1985, the governor of Oklahoma, George Nye, visited Gansu province, and he planted a friendship tree in a park in the capital city there of Lanzhou, and he signed a sister state friendship accord with the governor of Gansu. 1985, I was 2 years old, commemorating the establishment of the friendly relations between the state of Oklahoma of the United States of America and Gansu province of the People's Republic of China. George Nye, September 25th, 1985. That plaque is sitting right in front of the tree that's now a big tree 37 years later. In 1990, a Gansu delegation visited the Oklahoma State Fair. I'm hoping to go to this fair tonight with my kids and my wife. In 1990, a man named He Xuanqing at our state fair gave a speech, and he said this: "There is a place in China a lot like Oklahoma. The place has waving wheat, cattle, and oil. It is landlocked and has lots of grasslands on one side and woods on the other. We have the oil fields and farmers, and we grow wheat. There is big grass and cows and sheep. It is Gansu, a Chinese province." For 5 years now, Gansu has been Oklahoma's sister state. Now, I was a little late to the party. 90 years after William Borden died, in 2003, I first set foot in Gansu province, not knowing any of this at all, not knowing about Oklahoma, Gansu, not knowing about William Borden. I knew nothing. I was 19 years old. I spent weeks praying and learning Chinese and sharing the gospel in Gansu. While walking the streets of a particular city called Linsha, the city he mentioned in one of his speeches, I remember walking the streets that night as a 19-year-old, and something about that experience in that place. I had met a teacher and shared the gospel with him, and I was walking back to my hotel, and I remember feeling something inside me say, I could live here. Like, I just felt something unique about that place. Didn't know it at the time, but 2 years later, my wife and I were living there. Within 2 years, the Lord had taken us and planted us there. 2 of our children were born there. My son, Gabriel, 16 years old now, was born in that city right there, the Muslim city where we were living at the time, the same city that William Borden was trying to reach. That's where he wanted to go, never made it. My son was born there. The Lord took us there. 2005, my son was born. In 2008, as far as I can remember, is when I first heard about the Oklahoma-Gansu connection. 2008, we were already living there for number of years by that point. I remember sitting in our home in Gansu, and I almost fell out of my chair, and I said, this can't be a coincidence. Lord, you're doing something, and I'm glad to be a part, because we didn't go there with that in mind. From 2013 to 2018 especially, here's a modern map of Gansu province. The Lord impressed upon us just an urgency to take the gospel to more places and more counties and more districts. So we began hosting these teams that came from different parts of the U.S. to go short-term teams. I had many teammates be arrested and deported during that time. I got in trouble a few times. We had lots of issues with the police, but we were able to reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of homes with gospel literature for the very first time, even with the police kind of chasing us around. But in the spring of 2018, a little over 4 years ago, I was caught red-handed in a sting operation by the Gansu Public Security Bureau. Don't you like how they title things real nice sounding? The Communist Police are the Public Security Bureau. We're doing this because we love peace and safety. That's what they tell you. They arrested me, interrogated me one night, and then eventually deported me a few weeks later for possession of illegal, unauthorized Christian literature. During my interrogation, I committed myself to mobilizing more missionaries and more prayer and intercession for that very place. As a matter of fact, I was so convinced of that, and I was a little frustrated with the police, and I wanted to tell them, I'm going to do this. And I had to keep my mouth shut because I don't want to tell them my plans. I don't want to tell them what we're going to do. We're going to send more people back. We're going to pray more. I just had to keep my mouth shut, keep it to myself. That picture here is out of our 14th floor window. This is the house we lived in, the apartment, when I was arrested, when I was deported. That line through the picture there, that kind of angled line, that's the high-speed rail link. That's how the police escorted me to the airport. High-speed rail, 3 hours, 4 officers escorting me to the airport to send me out of the country. That was my last view of my home, was from that rail line, looking out the window back at the building here. I don't believe it's a coincidence that my home state, Oklahoma, and my adopted home of Gansu just happen to be friends. I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't believe it's a coincidence the Lord called us to live and serve in Gansu probably in answer to the prayers of men like William Borden 100 years before. I guarantee you they prayed for laborers. They prayed for more workers. This sister-state relationship that I talk about here was designed by the government for political, educational, economic reasons, whatever. But in the spirit of Paul, the Apostle Paul, and in honor of men like William Borden, I really do want to encourage you, any Christian in Oklahoma, to adopt Gansu for the purpose of prayer, embrace that friendship, and intercede for that place and those people. There are similarities, but there are differences. One of the main differences is Gansu is home to 30 million people. 30 million people. Just to give you an idea, if 3,000 of us in Oklahoma commit to pray regularly for Gansu, that's still only one of us for every 10,000 of them. 1 to 10,000. Those aren't good odds, but in God's economy, they are good odds. We put together a little website, and I'm closed. You can go and come back up, Taylor. Prayforgansu.com with the number 4, prayforgansu.com. On the website, you can download my story. I tell the whole story of my interrogation, everything that went on there. But also, the next slide, I've matched up not only the state of Oklahoma with Gansu, but every county in Oklahoma is matched up with a Gansu county. So if you're from a different part of the state and I'm visiting churches and I'm sharing this in different churches, we want each county to specifically pray for a county there, not just state for state, but more specific. And so here's an example. Caddo County, Oklahoma, just to the southwest, is matched up with Dongxiang. Dongxiang is one of the Muslim counties where William Borden wanted to go. We've spent many, many days ourselves in that county, Dongxiang. So let's pray that God would raise up more Pauls and William Bordens, young and old. And I want to challenge you, pray for this generation and future generations. China will not always remain the difficult place it is. Someday it will begin to open. And will we be ready? Will we be ready to go and serve those places, that place and those people, to disciple Gansu's millions? And may we never forget the words that William Borden was supposed to have said, but maybe actually didn't say, but it's still challenging to us. No reserve, no retreat, and no regrets. We don't leave anything on the table. We don't leave anything on the court. We give it all to him because he bought us with his blood. In Jesus' name, thank you guys.